a Marcionite apologist. Like you might consider me that. But actually, what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to give I'm trying to be somewhat balanced as a historian, right? And I may obviously, the idea of complete neutrality is, it doesn't exist. So just that's okay. But I do think that what I'm trying to do and what scholars do is we exercise something called the epoche, which is the reservation of judgment until all the data is presented. And of course, we will come up with a position. And I just want to emphasize that it doesn't matter to me what your final position is, just as long as you understand the issues at hand. So I'm just going to start just a very quick PowerPoint here to show some of the main issues. And this is just a sketch. Okay. So if one wanted to prove that the Marcionite gospel preceded canonical Luke, how would one go about saying that in an elevator when we only have 15 or 20 seconds? Well, you can think of this as starting with an external argument. A lot of people think that we've just always had the four gospel canon, that they were all written in the first century. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were, the fundamentalist version of history is that they were apostles or apostolic people. So they either knew Jesus directly or knew of him from other people. That is an ecclesial myth. And, we can't blow that out. We can't blow that out of the water. But I just want to present that as the founding myth of the church. That has no basis in historical reality, as far as I'm concerned as a historian. So we now have to be at least open to the idea that the four gospel canon, the really first person to attest to that is Irenaeus. Okay. And Irenaeus is writing between 180 and 185. So that's going to be 150 to 155 years after Jesus. That's the first time any author anywhere refers to, according to Matthew, according to Luke, according to Mark, and according to John, all together. So let that sink in. All right. That's an important point. So it's not as if Marcion, growing up in the one teens and, coming to Rome in the 130s, it's not as if he has his shelf in the back and he can just pull off the four gospel canon and then say, which gospel am I going to choose to rip to shreds? It's very, very tempting to present Marcion as the Jefferson Bible, the Jeffersonian kind of a guy who just takes scissors to an already pre-existing edition. But that edition just did not exist. And that is the great difference between Jefferson and Marcion. Marcion does not have the four gospel canon in the background. It simply did not exist. So what do we see when we look at Marcion's gospel? And that is reconstructions of it. We see that, and this is statistically relevant, we see that he's missing about 75% of material distinctive to Luke, whereas material that he shares with Matthew and Mark, he's got most of that in there. So that's significant. The question then is, if that's what's on paper, and this has been verified now by 4 scholars at least, if this is on paper, we have to have 2 possibilities. Either Marcion is aware of the 4 gospel canon, which I've just said is not historical, and he's saying to himself, how am I going to eliminate the distinctive material to Luke? What do I mean by the distinctive material to Luke? I mean the stuff that's in Luke, but it's not in Matthew or Mark. All right. So what are some examples here? Well, that would be the parable of the Good Samaritan. That's only in Luke. You can read Matthew and Mark. It's not in there. The prodigal son, that's only in Luke. The idea that John the Baptist is Jesus' cousin and that the angel Gabriel visits Mary, that's only in Luke. The idea that Pilate kills the Galileans, That's distinctly only in Luke. The Christmas story and the census of Quirinius, that's only in Luke. So did Marcion then have it in mind to say, I just don't like Luke, so I'm going to eliminate most of the material in Luke? Does that even make sense? Because to do that, he would have to have basically a synoptic addition and say, well, I'm aware that this material is not in Matthew or Mark, and because I'm aware of that, that's the material that I'm going to eliminate, right? Because it looks like when you read Marcion's gospel, he has so much less of this distinctive Lucan material. Is it more plausible that someone after Marcion, call him the Lucan editor, put in the material that was distinctive to him? And that's why that distinctive material, there's so much of it that appears to be missing from Marcion. So those are the two options. Again, either one, Marcion systematically, with a synoptic view, eliminates material distinctly from Luke, or someone after Marcion puts in that material. Add to this, the whole issue of the prodigal son, right? Would Marcion come to the parable of the prodigal son and say, nah, this has got to go? What's in the prodigal son parable that would bother Marcion? Well, its image of God as a loving father bringing home the son, the wayward son. That's pretty much Marcion's view of the loving, good God, the Father. So would he really want to just throw that parable out? Probably not. Okay. So, like there's no good reason. I mean, there have been reasons proposed, but what I'm presenting here in this short elevator speech is that there's no good reason for him to throw out the Good Samaritan or the prodigal son, because those parables perfectly fit Marcion's conception of the all good God who does good things, who is merciful and kind. Okay, he's totally on board with those parables. He would not want to cut them out. So the person who says that Marcion is the mutilator has to prove why it would be logical for Marcion to cut out that specific material. Okay. And I say that this is some of the best written material, right? It's like Marcion would have to have something against Christmas to cut out all the distinctly Lucan Christmas material, He would have to have something against the prodigal son, which is an extremely well-written, probably the most famous parable of all. He would have to remove that one. Right? That's the best written material in the gospel. That's what makes the gospel memorable today. He would have to eliminate that material. So that's the external argument. Okay. That's the situation we have in the early 2nd century. That's what the simple data is showing us when we're comparing Marcion and canonical Luke. Questions so far? All right, so you're with me, okay? Everyone still with me? Okay, all right. Well, then you're next you're halfway up the elevator. So your next thing that you turn to are internal arguments, okay? And you've got to be swift here in your response. So what would be some internal arguments for for comparing Marcion and the Lucan text? Well, we would have to look first of all at some of that unique material, and if we just begin at the beginning, we have this very ornate Lucan preface, right? So this appears only in Luke. He's the only one who has this preface, in which he wants to sound like he's very reliable. And he shows you the purpose of writing his gospel is actually to increase the reliability of the gospel. As it's said here, this is the NRSV, since many have undertaken to compile a narrative about the events fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses, and servants of the word, I too decided, as one having a grasp of everything from the start, to write a well-ordered account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may have certainty of the doctrines in which you have been instructed. I've slightly modified the text here, but the case is clear that whoever is writing this has an editorial game, that he's wanting to increase certainty. He's wanting to increase certainty. So if Marcion is finding this in his gospel text, the question is, why would he want to remove that prologue? Why would he want to remove that prologue? Because is Marcion against certainty? Is Marcion against the idea that there's eyewitnesses? Is Marcion against that? I wouldn't say so. This prologue is one long sentence, and it's the best Greek, some of the best Greek in the New Testament. It's the most refined, most exquisite periodic sentence that you'll ever find in the New Testament. Does Marcion want to take that away? And if so, why? That's a question that someone has to ask. And then to flip the coin, one has to ask, is someone writing this against Marcion? What would be the clues that this author has something against a previous edition of the text? Well, he says that he has a basis in certainty. He wants to make the gospel certain. And the way he does this is he says that the story goes back to eyewitnesses. Interestingly, he never says that he himself is an eyewitness, but he says the story goes back to eyewitnesses. Now, one of the things that, we have to keep in mind is that for the author of Luke, who is apparently the same as the author or editor of Acts, neither Marcion or even Paul were eyewitnesses of the historical Jesus. And that's why Paul is never one of the official 12. That's why Paul is not officially an evangelist, an apostle. He is an evangelist, but he's not an apostle. And so because he's not an eyewitness, he didn't see Jesus in the flesh. He only had some weird vision. Okay. So whoever is writing this preface wants to say basically that I want this gospel based in something that's fundamentally not Pauline, right? Because Paul, frankly, isn't really that interested in the historical Jesus, and he never met the guy. But I want to write a story that actually goes back to eyewitnesses. Okay, so is that anti-Marcionite? Well, it could be. It could be. It certainly could be. And we can't say absolutely because he's very coy, but it could be. Consider that this author, who's ever writing canonical Luke, wants to investigate from the start. Now, what would he mean by from the start? And is this an implicit criticism? Well, one of the things that we do know about Marcion's gospel is that it didn't have the birth narratives, right? And that makes the story of Jesus feel somehow incomplete to a lot of people. In other words, it's not a full biography, right? Because a biography has to include the tale from birth to death. And the fact is, if Marcion's gospel just throws you into Jesus's life, as if you're running, he just throws you into the ocean and says, sink or swim, all of a sudden, boom, we're in Capernaum in a synagogue. And I think one could make the argument, at least, that beginning, which is not really a beginning, is bothered some people. And it seems to have bothered the author of canonical Luke. So one of the things that he intends to improve on the story is he wants to start from the beginning, right? Or he wants to begin from the start. And so that would explain why there are these very, very well-written birth narratives that, of course, become the familiar Christmas story and one of the most famous parts of the New Testament. The Lucan birth narratives are extremely well written. And stylistically, they don't agree with the rest of the gospel. They're sort of like take you back to like this romantic period in Jewish history, and they're sort of like reading the book of Ruth or the book of First or Second Kings, and it's like you're in biblical history, and it's like you're reading the Septuagint, or the Septuagint is being rewritten. And so, but it's a very nice touch, like it's about shepherds, there's some angels in there, and it makes your heart feel strangely warmed. It's like, I mean, without this, we wouldn't have Christmas, right? So that's important to begin from the start. The final thing that this editor or this author wants to bring in is he wants to write an orderly account. He says that my gospel is better, not because I'm an eyewitness, but because I'm going to introduce to you some order. And one of the things that we notice with Canonical Luke and Marcion is that some of the stories are rearranged. Like, it has many of the same stories, but in Canonical Luke, those appear in different places. And so it raises the possibility that whoever the editor of Canonical Luke was taking a previous gospel and rearranging the stories so that they fit a better sequence, or what he considered to be a better sequence. And this goes back to the birth narratives. Like, he clearly thought that having a birth narrative is better than having no birth narrative. But in addition to adding that, he rearranged some material, as we'll see. Where does Jesus first appear? Does he first appear in Capernaum, or does he first appear in Nazareth? Where is his big debut? The author of Canonical Luke has the debut happening in Nazareth, and the author of Marcion's text has the debut happening in Capernaum. So who's right? Who's right? Who's more orderly? Right? These are the questions that are raised by the preface. Okay. All right, I'll stop there for a second. Any issues or questions? You're following me? Adia, please.
Yeah, it seems that, like, the different arrangements of Mark between Luke and Matthew, I mean, do they correspond at all with the different order that Marcion presents? Or, like, is Marcion more Matthew-like in order, or Luke-like?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think it's probably not easy to say or to put it in exactly that way. The way that I would put it is that Matthew is his own editor of Mark, and he has his own editorial purpose. And the reason why looking at Matthew and Mark is useful is because it shows us that when we have a prior text, Mark, it appears simpler and a bit more crude. And that when someone comes along later, what they do is they expand the text. And they also clean up the grammar and work on the links between the stories. And they add stuff that makes it a better story, that makes it a better biography, right? Because Matthew, one of the things that he does, of course, is he adds in the birth narrative, right? It's as if these Christians were just nervous about a story of Jesus without a birth narrative, that for whatever reason in the 2nd century, they felt compelled to add a birth narrative. It just so happens that Matthew's birth narrative and Luke's birth narrative are pretty different. But what we can see is that they both felt the need to put something there. So although we can't say that Matthew's editorial tendency would be exactly the same as the Lucan editorial tendency, there are similarities. And if we use the example of Matthew using Mark, which is, it's like the 99%, majority view of scholars today that Matthew uses Mark. There's a few holdouts. But if we just assume that Matthew uses Mark, we see what happens, that the text gets bigger more refined, with more stories, and that they tend not to cut things out. They tend to add things as a general rule. Okay. So that can help us think about who's first, because Marcion's gospel is a lot shorter than canonical Luke. And it doesn't have many of those great stories that we all know and love, or maybe we don't, but it doesn't matter. They're really well written. All right. So, sorry, we've got a lot of questions here. Pritish, were you first? Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah. No, just to point out that, and I think this is from Dr. Mark Bilby, that not only are those unique stories that we find in Luke, the prodigal son, the Good Samaritan, the John the Baptist sort of narrative in the background, and Quirinius and all of that. Not only are those unique Lucan materials missing from Marcion, and let's just say Marcion had some obscure, weird reason to take all of those out. What's also missing from Marcion's texts are very simple, like you mentioned, grammatic and phraseological things that we find in Luke. So Luke has, and Jesus turned to the disciples, and he keeps turning. I mean, Jesus and Luke keeps turning. Why would Marcion want to take that out of Luke and construct that's a silly reason to actually cut out Luke, to take out these these small phrases and words. And you can understand for some obscure philosophical reason to take out parables and stories, but these words bear no implication or have no bearing on Marcion's gospel. So that's a very silly reason to take those words out.
Right. Yeah. No, I would say, yeah. So the Mark Bilby method of data analysis is a useful support here, because it's very granular in the sense that it looks at individual words and it finds like Lucan tendencies for how words are used, lexical preferences, and this is how we all write. I mean, prior to data analysis, we of course knew in a larger sense that canonical Luke is much more refined than Marcion's text. It has better Greek. It has exactly the same, it shows exactly the same features that are more leaning into, certain what might be called classicizing features. It's just better Greek. And what data analysis allows us to do is just to be able to measure that very precisely, and to exactly say what is an author or an editor's idiolect. That is, how do they use words? And that's very useful. But again, I think we need to, data analysis is just one arrow in our quiver. So I always advise people to, when you're in an elevator, usually data analysis is going to be too long and too complex to explain, and you have to have a very, very good knowledge of Greek to make it make sense. So it's not my first go-to place, actually, but it is an arrow in the quiver, definitely. Jason, did you want to come in here? Sorry, you're muted still. Go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Sorry, I'm still getting used to this whole Google Meet thing. 2 points. I think that I think ultimately you're correct here, and I think scholarship's correct when we're looking at Luke and his tendency to expand. I think that, but I would also like to point out that that's not always the case, and with these kind of texts. Like, if anybody knows anything about the Coptic milieu of textual criticism, there's a lot of fluidity going on there. There's a lot of anybody who's familiar with hypertextuality knows that a text can be shortened or elongated for any number of reasons, depending on the needs of the author and what the purpose of the text is, right? So it's not always the case that these things get expanded. However, that being said, I think that just kind of touching upon the Lucan writer's tendencies to prove how learned he is with his historical prologues at the beginning of Luke and Acts. I think that's that's just something that kind of goes part and parcel with the type of writer that he is. Like, I think we've talked about it before, where you really see Luke, at whoever the author of Luke Acts was, you really see him shine in the book of Acts, because that's his book, versus a text that he already kind of has, that he has to kind of clean up and connect. So I think that just the learning that he displays in the knowledge of different genres that he displays in Acts is only partially reflected in something like Luke, which is a text that he's ultimately kind of cleaning up, for lack of a better term.
Right. Yeah. To lay down my cards on the table. And I think we're agreed on this, that the author of Acts and the editor of Canonical Luke are the same dude. And the difference is that he writes Acts from scratch, but he edits the pre-existing gospel to form Luke, right? So that's the theory. There are other theories, but that's my theory. The point about going from shorter to longer, I mean, that's right. Yeah, there are always exceptions, but I think it's still a general rule that when you think of texts, like Colossians and Ephesians, people think that Colossians is first, Ephesians is an expansion, Mark and Matthew is the expansion, Matthew's later, Jude and Second Peter is generally taken to be later, it's an expansion. If you're in Nag Hammadi, we have this phenomena happening in eugnosis and the wisdom of Jesus Christ. So eugnosis is prior, it's first and shorter than the wisdom of Jesus Christ is the longer expansion. But I think, if we wanted to get away from, always, like, this is not an ideology, it's just a tendency from shorter to longer. But I think another more useful way to think of this is just to say, as texts move through time, the story is improved, right? And so what I would emphasize with Canonical Luke is that whether you think whatever you think of who's first, the story, the granular nature of the Greek is improved, but the story is greatly improved. Like, when you think of the effect of Canonical Luke, like, seriously, folks, without Canonical Luke, there is no Christmas. Let that sink in. Like, Western society has been entranced by Canonical Luke. Like, it's such a well-written story. Like, it is amazing. And it has created, like, the mythology of Christmas. So it's a well-written text. So if you can think of Canonical Luke and Marcion's texts as kind of like rough draft and final draft, or story and then improvement on the story, obviously people with theological problems, with Canonical Luke are going to say, nah, it's a bunch of trash. But in terms of its literary quality, it's good. It's good. I mean, it even brings a tear to my eye, I mean, Ken, did you want to come in here?
Yeah, it was just slightly comedic. I've often thought when reading Luke that you've got chapters 1 and 2. That was the second start. You've got the start with the beginning with John the Baptist, and then let's take it as it's expanding Marcion. Then you've got additions on the back end as well. He missed an opportunity in not putting anything about the infancy, grabbing from some of the infancy gospels and putting something in. He missed an opportunity.
Well, it's not too late to rewrite. As I say, gospel literature, like, you should think of it as a moving target, and apocryphal texts are written every day. Like, so don't stop, don't think that the canon limits your creativity. Hopefully, if you present the third edition of Luke, that will replace the canonical version someday. So I encourage everyone here,
Well, in my retirement, I could do my PhD thesis on the latest found version of Luke.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Well, I mean, you in the end, you might not even need that fiction. You could just say my version's, just a better story.
Right.
Like, I really think that goes a long way. in thinking about which texts tend to get read more. Hugo, I think you're next. Do you want to hop in here?
I believe Manny is next.
Oh, Manny, do you want to go, please?
Oh, yeah. Do you think that Marcion knew about Mark, Matthew, or John? Is there anything on Marcion that reminds you of the other Gospels?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so Marcus Vincent, he thinks that Marcion does know Matthew and Mark. And I think that's probably right. But not because there's hard evidence. The reason why I think that's right is because what we know of externally of Marcion the man, we know that he's traveling around the Mediterranean in the 130s and 140s and 150s. So I definitely, even though I myself have a late dating for the finished forms of all the Gospels, I do think that by 150, all four are present, all four are circulating. So I think you have to assume that Marcion, as well-traveled as he is, has encountered these other texts. Now, he may have encountered them late in life, but I think he has encountered them. And I think that he did have a narrative about them, that when he did encounter them, that he considered them to be fictions, apostolic fictions, presenting a fictional Christ. And it made him even more zealous to promote his own gospel, because there was, he wasn't going to try to square the circle and say, we can have four. I think he was smart enough to know that there were contradictions, and that a lot of people in his day were trying to smooth out those contradictions. A decade after Marcion lived, Tatian gave us our very first gospel harmony, which is still popular among some circles today, where someone takes the four gospels and weaves them together into a single narrative, literally by cutting and pasting. And this was very popular in antiquity, and it's because they tried to convince themselves, early Catholics tried to convince themselves that this was telling the same story, but it was not. And they ran into insurmountable problems. And the truth is, you can never have a true harmony of the Gospels, because you have to get rid of and contradict other things. It's never perfect. And I encourage you, try it. If you think I'm wrong, try it. It's very, very difficult. Okay, Hugo, please go ahead.
I just wanted to say that my elevator pitch, will be that canonical Luke seems intent on asserting Jesus' Jewishness. Like, it wants to establish that link that he is Jewish. And I also go on a leap here, and I think that it doesn't want to, it wants to keep the relevance of the Old Testament. Because I think Marcion's teachings are very, Jesus' teachings through the Marcion gospel are very, a big break from the Old Testament teaching and the Old Testament God. So I believe that if you're gonna analyze a crime scene and say, okay, I believe that Luke added stuff to Marcion's gospel and wanted to drive a narrative, that will be the reason. The reason is establish Jesus' Jewishness and maintain the relevance of the Old Testament, because I think Jesus just completely did away with the Old Testament. What's a 180? But yeah, that's what I wanna say.
Yeah, I think so. In some sense, you're on the right track, but I think we just need to nuance that a bit, because, and this is one of the amazing finds about Marcion's gospel, whereas in reliable reconstructions, what we've discovered is that despite what the heresiologists say, Marcion does not have a problem with Jesus being Jewish, and he does not have a problem with Old Testament quotations. So Jesus still grows up in the region of Galilee. He's, of Jewish parents. And he teaches some Jewish things, and he says occasionally praises the law, and is often speaking in terms of Jewish scripture. In fact, his very last words, even in Marcion's gospel, come from the Psalms. Into your hands I commend my spirit. So I think the heresiological idea that Marcion is trying to de-Judify the gospel is just flat wrong, because when you look at the text, it's clear that that is simply evidentially, in terms of the data, not the case. So then you have to go back and think, okay, well, why is that stuff even in there? And one of the things that it has shown us is that Marcion is probably not an editor, because if he was an editor, he would have cut that out, right? Because I mean, even though I don't think Marcion was anti-Jewish per se, I think if Marcion was writing his gospel from scratch, he would not have included that material. I mean, think about it. Like, if he was writing from scratch, maybe he would have had Jesus born in Greece, you know, or Pontus. You know, like, the sky's the limit. Like, if you're creating a fictional hero, why have him born still in Galilee, appearing there, teaching in the synagogues? That don't make sense. Marcion ought not to like that. So probably he's inheriting a text which says those things, and he's thinking to himself, this text has authority, and I have no authority to change that. If I felt like I had the authority to change that, I would, but I don't. Hence, I won't. And so all of this is a matter of inference, but I think this is an important series of inferences that also throw into question more radical theories of Marcion as gospel author. I just don't think that's the case. If he was the gospel author, he would have written a very, very different story. Nick, please.
Okay.
To your point about Marcion knowing the other gospels or not, I'm just trying to understand your argument. So are you saying that he knows the 4 gospel volume, or that
no. Yeah. No, they all circulate separately. Yeah. So he knows them, and he knows them separately. Right. So but what we call the canonical edition, where we them all stapled together, like what we're used to in the modern period.
Yep.
He doesn't know that. He doesn't. That the first witness to that is Irenaeus. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, but listen, like how, like it really comes down again to a matter of inference, but I think it's a sound inference that you have this situation where, yes, the Gospels are all written pretty much by 150. I don't think anyone can seriously doubt that. Some people might push for like 160 or 170. Fine. But I think for, you know, it's not like Marcion stayed in one place, you know, so he must have known the other texts. And I think if we imagine, you know, different churches reading different Gospels in Pontus and North Africa and Rome and Spain, and Marcion has probably been to all these places. Why? Because he runs a shipping business, right? His whole career has been placed on a ship. It's not like he's ever stayed in one place. So does he know the other texts? Well, why wouldn't he? He would have to be blind. But of course, it all depends on one's reaction to it, you know? Like, you know, do evangelicals know of the Book of Mormon? Of course they do. Have they ever read it? Very few. Do they think it's the work of the devil? Probably, you know, it's like, yeah, obviously they know about it, but it's their reaction to it that, you know, determines how they deal with it. Let me just go quickly back to the challenge, and let me see if I can actually share the screen here. So the challenge is which came first, and as many of you noticed, I think, I mean, it's no surprise that you know, I'm not trying to fool you, but yes, Marcion's shorter text is on the left, and then canonical Luke is on the right. Okay, so I've begun where Marcion began, which is currently Luke 3 verse 1. And, you know, just pointing a few things out, that I think some of you have already pointed out is, yes, we have the opening line is pretty much the same, but whoever is writing this longer version is like wants to show off. Like, it's not only that, like, both authors want to chronologically and geographically place Jesus. Okay, we've got that. Okay. But then the other author wants to show off all of his geographical and political knowledge. It's as if like he's trying really hard to root Jesus in time and history. And although no one mentioned this, this figure Lysanias, like, no one knows about Lysanias, like, but he does appear like he's such a minor ruler. You're like, Abilene, where the heck is Abilene? Well, isn't that in Texas? You know, like, I mean, you know, like, who knows where Abilene is? Would any Roman know where Abilene is? No, it's like some piece of land out, you know, in modern Jordan, you know. But who knows of Abilene and Lysanias? It's actually Josephus. And this is why a lot of authors have said that Luke depends on Josephus, because he has these obscure figures that appear as characters in Josephus. Admittedly, they're not major characters, but they're there. And so that's canonical Luke, who's like on steroids, you know, like Marcion is like, okay, Jesus is a real dude. He's born at a certain time, you know, at a certain place with certain people ruling. And then Luke is like, I'm going to beef that up like I'm on steroids and give you all these obscure names that nobody ever heard of in the Greco-Roman world, but just to, you know, prove the point that Jesus is historical, you know, he's like going overboard. All right, so that's an interesting feature. And then your next question is, well, is that a feature of someone who's improving on the story, or someone, or is Marcion like coming to this and saying, you know what, I don't care about Herod, I don't care about Philip, I don't care about Trachonitis and Abilene or Annas and Caiaphas, so I'm just going to rip that out. Possibly. I mean, I'm not saying it's impossible, but the idea that Caiaphas appears as a character later in the story, I mean, why would you want to rip him out? Like, I don't know. It seems to me like this is an improvement on the story, or an improvement of someone who thinks he's trying to be historical. And then, of course, again, in Marcion's gospel, the first place he comes to is Capernaum. And now Luke has that, but this is one of his famous rearrangements. So Luke has the Capernaum episode, but for some reason he wants to bump up the Nazareth episode, right? Because for Luke, the Nazareth becomes so much more important than Capernaum. And why is that? Well, probably because he knows the birth tradition of Jesus born in Nazareth. But the other reason is because he wants to emphasize, you know, Jesus as like a preacher, basically, like someone hands him the scroll of the prophet Isaiah. That doesn't happen in Marcion's text. All that happens in Marcion's text is that Jesus, he doesn't read any Isaiah. He's not interested in Isaiah, but he quotes this proverb, which is actually a Greek proverb. It's not a Jewish one. Doctor, heal yourself. What things we heard happen in Capernaum do here also. Now that makes perfect sense if Jesus had just come from Capernaum. Whereas Luke has a real problem. Not only does he expand the text with this quotation of Isaiah, okay, he has the problem of explaining why anyone would mention Capernaum, because he doesn't feel at liberty just to remove that. So he's still got here this saying, do in your hometown things that you've heard done in Capernaum. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense because Jesus has never been to Capernaum, you know, not in terms of the story, right? So it's like this missing part, like Luke tricked himself, right? So he just rearranged the story, and all of a sudden, the back reference doesn't make any sense. So he see, like, this is where his editorial nod is, like he literally fell asleep. Now, some say that he tried to make this work by adding in a kind of like a summary sentence of Jesus's activity around Galilee. But of course, that's only a crutch, right? The fact is, he just doesn't have the Capernaum episode. And as I think, well, he does, but he has it later. Sorry. And I think, as Pritish pointed out, Pritish had a wonderful response to this, some really nice insights. One of the things that you said, Pritish, was that canonical Luke it's literarily a better story, but it explains why they got so angry enough to kill him. Like, all that Jesus has done in Marcion's text is just quote a medical proverb, like, and that's not enough to piss people off to the point where they're ready to kill you. But in canonical Luke, he's got this long reason of why, this long rationale why Jesus pissed off this local Jewish synagogue. And so it makes sense that they're now ready to hurl him off the cliff. Whereas in the previous story, it's like, why did they get so angry? It makes no sense. I mean, what's their problem? Are they crazy? Like, all he said was, "Doctor, heal yourself. Heal yourself." So what's the issue? On the right, canonical Luke is a better story in the sense that it makes better connections. Now, Pritish, you had said something else. I forget now what you said. Did you want to come in here and mention anything else?
No, I was just saying that yeah, overall it looks like there are more features in keeping with the Lucan redaction of the earlier Marcion material. It's just that one that point that I found that Luke had a better explanation of why the crowd is angry and want to throw him off the cliff versus Marcion's passage. I didn't have a clear idea why the folk at was it Nazareth? Yeah, why the folk at Nazareth were angry just for, like you said, just for Marcion's Jesus saying, physician, heal yourself. So yeah, that was. But I also wanted to point out that Capernaum is a very small village that Josephus mentions in one of his books. It's actually he mentions it sort of by the by because he fell off his horse at Capernaum and injured himself. Otherwise, he wouldn't have mentioned Capernaum. And it's interesting that the writer of I think both passages. I think at least Marcion's passage has the city Capernaum as a city, which is sort of not incorrect in a way, because Josephus is from Galilee. He would know that it is a village. So I just wonder if the person writing Marcion's gospel also sort of had Capernaum there as part of the narrative, and didn't really know much about the place.
Yeah, that's a great example. Again, of if they knew Josephus, they would not have made that mistake. But Luke, who knows Josephus, a bit more careful. Yeah. Manny, were you first? So we have Manny and Nadia. Did you want to go ahead, Manny?
Yeah. What are Marcion sources? It doesn't talk about the John Baptist, which every scholar thinks is one of the only things that historical Jesus, you can say that he did. The rest is mythologies.
See, that's why the canonical bias is such a disease, because, like historians, and most of them are religious, like this historical Jesus people. They're like, want Jesus to be historical, just like Luke wanted him to be historical. So they're like grasping at straws. And so one of the things that they grasp at is this connection with John the Baptist, right? Whereas if they took Marcion's gospel seriously, they would realize that too is insecure, right? So for Marcion does mention John the Baptist several times, but it's definitely not clear that he was ever Jesus's teacher, and he never baptized Jesus. So this whole synoptic line of Jesus somehow being connected to John as a disciple and then going off on his own way after being baptized by John and having a vision, that is It's just as fictional as everything else, as far as I'm concerned. And if you took Marcion's gospel seriously, you would see that as well. That's an attempt to improve the story, right? Because Marcion doesn't have the baptism, and clearly the other gospels are offended by this, right? I think canonical Luke, the editor, is very offended by this, and so he's like, "Where's the baptism? We need that bit, so that part gets added." And then if you've got the baptism comes in a sequence with other things like the temptation in the wilderness. So Marcion doesn't have that either. So like what you consider like the core narrative of the synoptic tradition just isn't in Marcion. And it raises all sorts of problems for Q scholarship as well, because people think that was in Q. Well, if it's not in Marcion, then apparently he's not reading Q, or Q doesn't exist. Take your pick. Adia.
With regards to the quote, I believe I was reading through Bilby's work, and it reflects like an earlier, perhaps Homeric or like a story about Asclepius. And I'm wondering if perhaps that's what triggered the rage, or would be a reason for it to trigger rage, like if they just associate it with like a Greek god or whatever.
Yeah, that I think would be very hard to prove on the basis of the text alone. I know there's a very strong wing of scholarship. Bilby's part of it. Dennis MacDonald's the main figure that really wants to see the Gospels as based on mythology or based on mythological stories. And I think on some level, I've addressed that in my work and how the Gospels became history. Like I do agree with that on a general level. But in terms of proving like specific stories, like something like an Asclepius healing or something like Dionysius, that's harder to do. It's harder to prove that there's a direct relation of dependence. So my attitude is, we're fighting a battle where we are the minority. Marcionite priority is still the minority. I'd rather not complicate the issue with something that's also going to annoy the opposition, right? Which is the idea that the Gospels are based on mythology. I think in a general sense that, yes, they are informed very much by mythology. But what I want to focus on is just, in the elevator speech, you don't have a lot of time to prove that. And you're certainly not going to win over a fundamentalist or a fellow member of the Southern Baptist Convention, in an elevator. But what you could do in an elevator is you could say something like, well, here's one text, here's the other, and canonical Luke doesn't make sense because it's referring back to Capernaum, even though Capernaum doesn't happen prior. Whereas Marcion's text starts with Capernaum and then refers back to Capernaum, and we can fairly easily chart that actually, and just show that to people so that makes a difference. And I've got my slide up here. I'll just go very briefly back to the slideshow. You can very easily show people in a simple chart that in the gospel, the Marcionite gospel, he's in Capernaum, and then there's a reference back to Capernaum. In canonical Luke, we've got Nazareth first, referring back to Capernaum, but Capernaum, the episode itself, appears later. So who's first? Who rearranged it? It's sort of like, you're a teacher in a class and your students are writing term papers and you have to figure out who depends on who, right? And I'm sure AI can do this pretty well by now. And the fact is, I would say that the plagiarist, that's a loaded language, but the plagiarist is the one who forgot to get rid of or felt like he was unable to get rid of this back reference to Capernaum back in 423. And so there you go. One other quick point which I think goes back to a point made by Hugo, is that one of the things that we know about Marcion, and we know this from Tertullian, is that he believed that his gospel was corrupted. And it was corrupted specifically, and this apparently goes back to Marcion's own language. It was corrupted because it was made into a single unit or body with the law and prophets. Now, some people have taken this to mean that, Marcion's gospel would have no law and prophets, but that's not true. The complaint is not that the law and prophets are there. The complaint is that the gospel is being made into a single unit with the law and the prophets, which means that there's a continuous story of salvation history, and that whoever is writing canonical Luke is trying to convince you that everything that Jesus does has been prophesied. And that is borne out time after time after time. If you look at distinctly Lucan material, like at the end of the story, that this is not in Marcion's scriptures, but it's clearly something the editor is wanting to emphasize, that beginning with Moses and all the prophets, Jesus interpreted to them the things about himself. Well, I don't think for Marcion that's possible. For Marcion, it's possible to quote the Jewish scriptures, but it's not possible to say that Jesus is fulfilling everything in the prophets. And again, it's emphasized later in that chapter that these are the words Jesus is speaking here. Everything written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms must be fulfilled. Well, that's not something that Marcion would subscribe to, certainly. He has no problem citing the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms, but he would have vigorous disagreement that those things are fulfilled in Jesus. And so what the author of Canonical Luke is saying is that you need a sort of epistemological revolution in your mind. You need to transform your brain so that you can open your mind to understand the scriptures, because no one else prior to Canonical Luke, or maybe Justin Martyr, wanted to systematically say that pretty much all the prophecies in the Old Testament are pointing to Jesus. That's a new revelation. That's like, well, it's not even a revelation. It's just a conclusion that early Catholics are coming to in the mid-2nd century. And then they are rewriting the story, revising the memory so that the new information maps onto, the old information maps onto the new insight. And, a lot of this I'm dependent on a wonderful book. If you've been able to get it, it's very expensive, but it's by Matthias Klinghardt, called The Oldest Gospel. And one of the things that he does, and it's quite difficult to read, even though he published it in English. There was a German version 10 years before. So it's still not like the easiest book to read, but if you want to buy it, I can send you the Amazon link. But one of the things that he says is that, and he's right here, that there's material, the distinctive material in Luke has an emphasis on identifying Jesus and on, emphasizing the necessity of his suffering and expounding, as he says, expositing the mission based on Old Testament texts. And this sure as hell sounds like someone trying to make the gospel one body or a single unit or unity with Jewish scripture. And so Marcion's critique sounds like he's critiquing canonical Luke, even though it's never actually clear. Like, Marcion doesn't know the name Luke, so it's not like he can tell you, oh, I'm criticizing canonical Luke. And then the very last point that I think that Klinghardt makes here is that Marcion's gospel doesn't have any redaction, what he calls redactional coherence. And what he means by that is this consistent editorial tendency, if we assume that he edited Luke, because it's not like he's trying to get rid of the Psalms, the prophets, and the Torah. He's not doing that. But if you imagine the Lucan author as editing Marcion, he does have a very consistent theological line, and that is, as I think was said earlier, to root the Jesus story deeper in Israelite salvation history. And that is absolutely consistent throughout all of Luke, that's the point. That's the point. And what that shows is that, or what that indicates is that a conscious and very smart editor is going through the material and making sure that all the material agrees with that tendency, right? Whereas if you flip the table and say, Marcion comes later, then it makes Marcion look like a bad editor, like he's slovenly. Like at some points he's taking away the Old Testament stuff, and at other points he's leaving it in, and he's just stupid. And even the heresiologists mention this. They're like, wow, maybe this guy is just stupid, because I can't believe he left this shit in. You know, I mean, you know, sorry, my French here, but I mean, that's essentially what they say, you know? So who's right? This admittedly lasted a lot more than an elevator speech, but this is basically what you say to people. You have external arguments and then internal arguments, and you just show them the data. And I hope that all or most of this at least made sense. Any closing insights or thoughts on any of this, Hugo?
It's a random question. Might not be related to what we're discussing, but did Marcion include the part where Jesus has the sermon in the Temple Mount, and then he takes notice of the money changers and attacks the money changers, or like dismantle the? Does he do that, or is that's not part of Marcion?
Not there. Yeah, not there. Yeah, canonical Luke has minor other sub themes going on, and one of the sub themes in canonical Luke is well, it's not really anti-rich discourse, or anti-wealth discourse. It's you know, because he doesn't mind, you know, people getting rich, but he wants rich people to make big donations. That's what, and this shows up in Acts, and the author of Acts clearly wants rich people in the community, but he wants them to give up all their property. So yes, he will go back into Luke and add stories that encourage people to give, you know. So a lot of people say that he's anti-wealth, but that's actually a misnomer. No, he's anti-keeping your wealth. And what he wants to do is encourage people to give it up, right? That's how the church gets rich. And it worked, by the way. If you've ever seen the Vatican, very nice building. But anyway, you get my point. Jason.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, everybody. I promise I'll be less long-winded next time. But 2 points. I think that, you know, doing the studying for today's discussion has really created a kind of newfound appreciation for Luke as an author. You know what I mean? I think that this kind of example of intertextuality is not strange at all in antiquity. And you know, the best, actually a good analogy that I kind of have been mulling over today while this discussion has been going on is what Apuleius does in his Metamorphoses with a text like the Greek Onos or Ass story, where it's just the bare bones in the Greek, and then Apuleius, very much like Luke, takes this bare bones story and he intersperses it with actually very similar stories. You have like the bad managers of the estate, things like that. You have lots of sons in there in various different situations with their father, whether that be good or bad. And Luke really does create like a kaleidoscope with his text that you don't really see in the other books, because Luke is kind of immersing you in other stories, one after the other after the other, in a very laid out way, and a very deliberate way. And the second one, I don't know if I should say, I don't want to be mean, but talk to a lot of classicists, as you know by now, David. And I don't buy, of course, with Luke, especially with something like Acts, where Barnabas and Paul are being mistaken for Hermes, or Zeus and Hermes, or the different allusions to Homer with Paul on the island with the viper bite, things like that. I think when Luke is doing something like that, you can more concretely say that the author is very much drawing from different genres of not specific, well, myth, but also like Luke is taking from different kind of genres. And I don't want to be mean, but I just don't buy it that the other authors of the Gospels were taking from Greek myths. It's just, I talked to a lot of classicists and none of them buys it. So I don't buy it either, but that's just my opinion. So, sorry.
Sure. Yeah. No worries. Yeah. But I think, yeah, the Anas, or the ass moving to the golden ass, is a great example. If you want a more modern example, it's the Wizard of Oz moving to Wicked. You know, it's someone trying to improve on the story. And this is what great novelists do, right? Like, you don't always have, it's what people who want to make a prequel and a sequel do all the time. You know, the new Star Wars, you know, it's like trying to improve on the story by giving it a backstory or a future story, you know, and so we see this happen all the time, and it's about improvement, right? Or perceived improvement. Like, we may, as movie critics personally, just think like, oh, that's crap.
And you know, that's a great point. That's
Yeah.
a great point. I wanted to mention this real quick because it kind of came up to me earlier. What Luke is kind of doing with the Gospel of Marcion, or Proto Luke, whatever you want to call it, is I almost see it like in cinematic terms as like a soft reboot of the original story into a new, say, cinematic universe. Kind of like what they did with those early Marvel movies that weren't necessarily connected together too well, but that's just kind of like a little interesting way of looking at it. It's like canonical Luke is a soft reboot of the proto-Lucan text.
Mhm.
Helpful.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, whether you love him or you hate him, you know, if you love Christmas, you have to give this guy a high five. Manny.
Yeah. What is the notion of salvation in Marcion? What is very strange to me is the connection between Luke and Marcion, because Luke is the only of the Gospels that doesn't talk about atonement by that Jesus died in the cross to atone for the sins of people. This
Sure.
is Pauline, and since he is very Pauline, Marcion, what is his notion of salvation?
Right. Well, I would even say, like, for Paul, atonement is like a minor wing of the broader program. I think we will talk more about this later in the course, but just the short answer is that for Marcion, he follows what's called a Christus Victor model of salvation, which is that you know, Jesus's blood, the blood of a slain deity, doesn't save us. It doesn't appease an angry God. That's a silly, barbaric, mythic idea, childish, in fact. The way that Jesus saves us is, and going back to something Hugo said, is Jesus rescues us from a dark cosmos. Jesus comes in as the hero to the story, like Iron Man, blasts into this world and takes us out of it. And so we are redeemed by, you could view this as like a hero model of Christ. So Christ is the hero and we follow him, right? So that's how this works. And, you know, there's a little bit of that in canonical Luke. It's not like the author of canonical Luke would disagree with that strongly. But we'll see, you know, later on in the course where canonical Luke wants to make some modifications to Marcion's model. But that's basically it. It's the Christus Victor model. Christ is hero. Christ is redeemer from this world.
That is more like John.
It
John
is a bit more like,
the man that comes from outer space and comes to the land and is talking about the Father, blah 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 blah. you know, and goes to the salvation. But
Right. Yeah.
Luke is nothing like that.
Well, I mean, again, I think that it's not like there's an amazingly consistent picture in Luke. I think that he's a bit eclectic in his model. But basically, yeah, it's like repent and believe, and your sins will be forgiven.
That's right.
And yeah, it's kind of bland. And yeah, apparently that model, still works for some people. But I think I think a person can have more than one model of salvation going at the same time, and they may not even be conscious of the fact that they have multiple models, and they just, it's all, buzzing around confusedly in their head. And so, yeah, I think in some respects that's probably what's going on. Certainly, if you're reading the New Testament synthetically, I mean, they don't agree, and so these concepts all sort of like fuse into each other after a while. Any other? Oh, go ahead, Manny. Yep.
Well, the idea that Jesus died on the cross to save, to atone for the sins of men is one idea that Paul invented, and it's probably one of the most stupid ideas that exists. So
Right.
God creates man, and the man sins about the God, so sins, and then God waits 4,000 years to come to earth and suffer and die to please himself.
Right. Yeah. Or if you have more of a dyadic model, I mean, it can get more sinister that God is only pleased by killing his son, which is an act of violence. And
Exactly.
Yeah. No, it's very problematic. And yeah, thankfully, Marcion, wasn't interested in that weird way of thinking. Yeah. Hugo.
I just want to quickly add for Manny that he will be very interested in looking into Gnostic tests about Sophia, the archons, the eons, the eons, the archons, the Yahweh. There is a very fascinating Marvel movie in there. Really, it's like a great movie, like a story. It's a great story. But a quick Googling of that, you can find a lot of references to much deeper stuff. I don't want to go into it, but it's.
Oh, I'm sure Manny.
It's a
I'm
rabbit
sure
hole.
Manny, you know all that. I mean, Manny,
Well,
from what I've seen, you know all that anyway.
I find already the Trinity so
Yeah.
so strange that those Gnostics are even more strange.
Mm. Yeah, well, and that's another thing. One of the ironies of Marcion is that Marcion obviously isn't Trinitarian because he lives, at least 150 years before they hammer any of that out officially. But interestingly, modern Marcions want to be Trinitarian. I don't understand that. 2025 is the anniversary of 325, the Nicene Creed, and that's where you get sort of this early Catholic Trinitarianism codified, and people are all excited about that. But for some people, that's like the fall of the church, and we'll talk about, because it's also the council called by Constantine. But we'll talk about in future lessons why Marcion himself thought that the church had fallen. For him, it was different reasons. But what we'll focus on next week, next Monday for everybody in the upper regions of the cosmos. What we'll focus on is which traditions are reliable for Marcion's gospel, and how one would determine that would determine reliability. And this is a very touchy question, admittedly, and it's where a lot of disagreements are going to come out. But it's such an important question because it is the way that you overcome the so-called evangelical or fundamentalist, common line is that Marcion isn't relevant because Marcion doesn't survive, right? So, and then, even if they're aware that there's been reconstructions of Marcion's gospel, they say, well, the reconstructions don't agree, so I guess I can just dismiss and ignore it, right? So how does one overcome those objections? And this is very important because I think this is one of the places where you can really, even if you're a Marcion buff, like you're a Marcion nerd, it is still very confusing why people like Dieter Roth, Jason Dune, and Matthias Klinghaar have very, very different editions of Marcion's gospel. And there's a very clear reason why, but not a lot of people know it. And so that will be the focus of what we talk about next time. And as usual, I'll send out readings. And but if there's any additional questions or concerns, feel free to email. I will try to, I don't want to give people homework, but I want to make sure that this is a real course, that you get things out of it. So if there's something in the readings that don't make sense, or in the challenges or anything, please come back at me, and we'll make sure that everything makes sense, at least, and have yourself armed with questions for the actual session. Sound good?
Sounds good. Yeah,
Okay.
I noticed that you've got 16 degrees down there, and we've got 28 here. Now, those are two, from a scientist's point of view, those are very important numbers, because 16 is 61 in foreign temperatures, and 28 is 82 in foreign temperatures, and you can use those two numbers to interpolate. 16 is 61, 28 is 82.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, hopefully we'll get to 20 degrees Celsius by 4 p.m. here. Yeah. That is one of the reasons I love living down under. Yeah, we really don't have winter, but I guess it's improved my sense of the cosmos, because
Winter.
yeah, they used to say that Jonathan Edwards, had this sermon about sinners in the hand of an angry God, because he always had to live through the New Haven winters in North America. There's a lot of truth to that. I mean, if you live through a winter in the Northeast US, you have to believe that God is evil. I mean, why would he inflict 6 months of cold on you? I don't know. But anyway, okay, that's beside the point. It's great seeing all you folks, and thank you for coming. And
David, just a quick question about the material that you've given with the course. It's excellent. Thank you so much. It saves us a lot of hassle trying to get all of this material from elsewhere. So I really thank you for that. Just in terms of how would you suggest us going through the material, just at our own sweet time, or do you have you want us to cover certain material before?
Well, yeah, it's a good question, because all of you should have access to the pre-recorded Marcion course, which has lots and lots and lots of videos and texts for you to look at. That's stuff that you can do on your own time, if you have time. But the things that I really want you to read, that's the stuff that I'm going to send out through email. That's going to be the focused readings and challenges. So if you only have time for that, just focus on that, and then you'll have eternal access to all the lectures and the pre-recorded course. So you can tackle that anytime. That's up to you.
Thank you.
David,
All right.
I read those three Gospels of Marcion, and they look all different and so on. Do you have a Gospel of Marcion that we can discuss? Can you send it to us?
I can't legally do that, but there in the pre-recorded version, I do have some text for you. I recommend Badoon as the starter text, and I can send everyone the Amazon link if you just want to buy Badoon. But that'll be the focus of next week, and I think after we go through the session next week, you'll have a very good idea of what you will want to purchase and go further. Yeah, but if
Okay,
you want to
thank
get
you.
that, like I would get a physical edition of Badoon, and yeah, I can send everyone the link if you want. All right.
Yeah, it's good value.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Ken has it. Yep. Good. Well, it's reached Australia. Thank God. Okay. Excellent.
Do you think there's an opportunity for rotation too, a harmonization of those three?
No, unfortunately, they cannot be, and I'll tell you why. But it's because they're fundamentally different in editorial principles. Yeah. Yeah. Unfortunately. Well,
Okay.
I'll get that secret and revealed Gnostic information very soon. So I wish everyone a very good weekend and look forward to seeing all of you again very soon. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Cheers.
Bye-bye.